Welcome back to News with Rupert. Today we are going to put the Michelle Latimer controversy into context. I know I'm very behind the news cycle, but that's because News with Rupert isn't just about headlines. We want our audience to come away with some meaningful knowledge. We also use real VHS cameras, and by we I mean me because I just pretend to have a 90s news team. Michelle Latimer, for those who don't know, was challenged very publicly in 2020 for a 2-decade-long claim to being an Indigenous filmmaker. A CBC article caused a nationwide media feeding frenzy because it articulated that she is actually of French Canadian, Scottish, and Irish heritage. Let's get this straight. Everybody can agree that she's a filmmaker, and most white people who know nothing about Indigenous people think she's Indigenous. You know, people like Jonathan Kay, former National Post editor, who consistently has really strong opinions on things he has not studied very much. In defense of Latimer, he wrote an entire article and stated that she was being cancelled from filmmaking because of her DNA. This is a purposeful misinterpretation of the issue. He is being willfully ignorant to the larger picture. Isn't Canada a place people come to escape oppression? He sardonically asks. Well, Jonathan, why don't you go ask that to a residential school survivor? Judging by your 2014 article defending the residential school system for the good they did, I'd say you need an update on the truth. Beneath the sensationalized identity scandal is the pain felt amongst Indigenous people in the film community and those who found her work a source of inspiration and meaningful representation within a homogenous industry. Since the CBC article, Latimer has lost her role as director and writer in several Indigenous-focused projects, has been asked to return awards and grants, and had her documentaries removed from shelves faster than a Steven Seagal movie. Oddly enough, Steven Seagal claims to be Indigenous too, and has followed his ancestral connections to the Kanien'kehá:ka people, or Mohawks, at Kahnawake.
Genealogists that are two of the best. I was able to uncover not just the genetic lines, also recent photographs of, for example, my grandmother, who surely looks pure Mohawk. And I'm pretty sure she is.
I can see why some people at Kahnawake would be pumped to have the star of Exit Wounds be their long-lost cousin, but does an ancestor from 1710 really make you an Indigenous person? Michelle Latimer seems to think so because, like Seagal, her family connections go back to the same century. It's important for Canadians of all backgrounds, but especially for white Canadians, to be aware of her story and what it means for the relationship between us and the Indigenous people who've been systematically eradicated by our institutions and are by all means survivors of a genocide. As Anishinaabe comedian Ryan McMahon said, Canada is going through its reckoning. The skeletons are literally coming out of our closets, the closets being unmarked graves on the sites of former residential schools. As of July 3rd, 2021, the numbers are at 1,505 individual children's bodies at just 7 residential schools. There were 139 residential schools. Across Canada, each one of them will likely have a genocidal burial pit where the church and state attempted to hide their crimes against Indigenous children from the rest of the world. Amidst this gruesome reckoning with her own national identity, we have smaller stories like Latimer's, which show how Canadian institutions continue to harm Indigenous people through their support of non-Indigenous pretenders that assume roles of power and authority. The popular term in use today is pretendian. But people have been mobilizing in large numbers against these frauds. On June 14th of 2021, Queen's University came under scrutiny for its protection of 6 academics with questionable claims to indigeneity. In a statement made by a group of Indigenous scholars, one of who is Kim Tallbear, a professor of Native Studies at Alberta University, attention was drawn to the Queen's situation as a systemic one. The statement is signed by over 100 academics who simply ask that these universities fulfill the constitutionally protected rights afforded to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to develop transparent policies and procedures regarding the equity of hiring such people. Pretty fair, I think. It also mentions that white fantasies of self-indigenization erase real Indigenous people who have been displaced through genocidal tactics mandated by the Indian Act. It may seem like a stretch to connect Michelle Latimer to genocide, but it's not. She made the connection herself in an interview with Fashion Magazine in 2020 when she stated, "Our grandparents went to residential schools." The statement can be taken in 2 ways. One, in general, the grandparents of Indigenous people were taken, and she is a part of this wider community. Or 2, Latimer's own grandparents were taken. But by stating this, she makes the audience assume it's the latter, that her Indigenous grandparents were separated from their family and taken to concentration camps masked as education centers where children were stripped of their culture and humanity and killed at rates comparable to a war zone. The UN defines genocide as including separation of children from families. Latimer has therefore included her family in this context and assumed the identity of a survivor. The truth is, census records clearly show her grandparents were white people. They were not taken to residential schools. Neither were her great-grandparents. Even Latimer's personally appointed expert genealogist, who she only hired after the scandal broke nationally, found no indigenous root ancestor later than 1751. You know who else was alive in 1751? This guy, Ferdinand VI of Spain. I mean, we're talking all for one and one for all D'Artagnan and the Three Musketeers, an era so long ago that your ancestry pool is over 500 individual people, and you're selecting one out of these hundreds of people to literally define yourself by. The academic Darryl LaRue, Associate Professor of Social Justice and Community Studies at St. Mary's University, has an entire book on this issue, Distorted Descent, White Claims to Indigeneity. And I happen to have it right here. It's the first official book in Rupert's Book Club. In the opening chapter, LaRue references two renowned historians, Hubert Charbonneau and Bertrand Desjardins, who state that there is a substantive difference between finding limited indigenous ancestry in one's family tree over 3 centuries ago and being an indigenous person today. The act of finding a distant ancestor has been called communing with the dead because it disregards connections to living indigenous communities in favor of lineal descent or connections to dead people. To self-identify solely in this way completely ignores family networks and matriarchal kinship practices, which in the case of the Métis, define their peoplehood. Interestingly enough, throughout this trial, Latimer did have one other group speak up on her behalf. The ancient tribe of Burning Man have claimed her as a princess, and she is to be the guest of honor at the 2022 event when everything's back to normal. Before I go on, I must state that in this episode, I'm in no way discrediting or criticizing people who are disconnected from their indigenous roots due to colonial violence, and I am not judging people from mixed families who sometimes get perceived as being from other ethnic groups due to these expressed phenotypes. The Michelle Latimer story is such a sensitive topic precisely due to these factors, but it is quite obvious when you look deeper that there is a reality in Canada that makes pretending to be indigenous or relying purely on self-identification not only easy to do, but a method for occupying places of power and posing a threat to indigenous autonomy and identity everywhere. Writer, director, and brilliant Blackfoot Dene satirist Gits Crazy Boy made the following statement in his podcast.
From the perspective of the colonizers and white people generally, they tend to think of culture as just blood or DNA. That's their limited understanding of what it is to be us. DNA and skin color are just one component, and they're all kind of the same. They all fall in the same category. We have many facets and components to authenticate indigenous identity. Mainly, these rely on community ties and kinship. We've done enough to survive colonization, the destruction of who we are, the destruction of our identity, to tell you what the fucking rules are.
On a side note, Gits just came out with a hilarious piece of satire called Peace Pipeline. It's on YouTube, and I recommend you watch it. The main issue here is that we have a person with French, Canadian, Scottish, and Irish ancestors who self-identifies as Algonquin Métis, not due to her experiences in a community or connection with any living relatives, but solely on family lore. Furthermore, she never sought to expand on her understanding of where she came from, or if the connection could be legitimized in a deeper way other than romanticized stories from her grandfather, who, according to Michelle's 2021 blog post, was a hunting and fishing guide for the majority of his younger years. She goes on to say that his knowledge and respect for the land was a gift he passed down, and it continues to shape who I am today. It's not the only time a vague form of land appreciation seems to equate being an indigenous person in her mind. And even in subsequent footnotes on this theme, there is no reference to specific cultural knowledge. Early in her career, Latimer identified as Métis, but much like her grandfather, did not know that the Métis was not simply a mixture of any indigenous and European person. Métis people have their own language and group of languages, as well as ways of dressing, dancing, making music, preparing food, and establishing community ties. Latimer added Algonquin French to her bios, but still, in media interviews as recent as 2020, the French-Canadian part of her ancestry was left out of the description. She just became Michelle Latimer, Indigenous Director. That is what can be called race shifting. And no, it's not a movie with Vin Diesel. When Latimer was asked in 2020 by the Canadian Film Board to prove her heritage and to name where she was from specifically, she named the closest proximate indigenous community associated with her grandfather's stories. She couldn't mention her grandfather's exact town because it was flooded in 1927 and is now underneath the Basketon Reservoir. Nor did she choose just to say Maniwaki, which was historically populated by French and Irish settlers and where her mother's side comes from. Instead, she chose the distinctly separate Algonquin community of Kitigan-Zabi, which was renamed in 1991 and formerly called Maniwaki Reserve Number 18. Now that is what I call a stretch. Her claims to Kitigan were contained in a press release for the Toronto International Film Festival on August 14, 2020. To Latimer's surprise, no one there knew who she was, and from that point on, things began to unravel. Let's do a quick review of Michelle's career before we delve into the greater meaning of her controversy as a pretendian. Michelle Latimer is a Canadian filmmaker, writer, and director. She studied theatre at Concordia University in 2001, playing the role of Trish Sinkin on the Canadian soap opera Paradise Falls. According to Let's Watch TV, her character was a bisexual goth teen. All episodes are available on YouTube. I'd say it's like softcore porn meets Twin Peaks. In 2011, she wrote and directed an animated short film called Choke, centering around a First Nations man who leaves his res for the city. In 2016, she directed Rise, a Vice documentary focusing on Indigenous resistance at Standing Rock. In 2017, she directed the short film Nuka. Most recently, she was the showrunner for the critically acclaimed TV series Trickster, based off the novels by Haisla Healthsuck writer Eden Robinson. And she directed the multi-award-winning documentary The Inconvenient Indian, adapted from the wildly successful book by Thomas King. Damn, that's a lot of Indigenous filmmaking for a white chick.
Making my way downtown, walking fast, faces pass, I'm homebound.
Throughout this impressive career, she has taken the spotlight on magazine covers, TV interviews, TED Talks, and prestigious stages across the country, often being lauded as the new leader of Indigenous filmmaking and being granted the biggest projects ever awarded to an Indigenous media artist in Canada.
It is not an easy time to be Indigenous.
The initial information about Latimer's false claim was all revealed to the Canadian public in the December 17, 2020 CBC article co-written by long-standing Indigenous topics writer Jorge Barrera and Ganosio Deer, who hails from Ganawage. In it was the response from Kitigan Zabi elder Claudette Commanda.
Ain't no gangster shit, this warrior shit.
Commanda stated that Latimer's actions were an insult and an appropriation of her identity, culture, and community. Think about it. She did not grow up there. It's unclear whether she's even visited Kitigan Zabi before this claim, yet she says that's where she's from. Micmac writer and comedian Candy Palmater had the following to say during her appearance on the CTV show The Social.
So when someone claims a community, like they go to that point of claiming a community, but have no ties, it's hard for us to swallow it.
And fellow Mi'kmaq film director Jeff Barnaby, who wrote and directed Blood Quantum, says that if she is Native, then she is from somewhere. Anyone who wants to represent a Native community has to hail from a Native community. This is where we can see how Latimer's story relates to a wider issue in Canada of formerly white people switching to an Indigenous identity for monetary or professional gains. Pretty much any writer discussing pretendians in Canada will reference the Powley decision, which was a Supreme Court of Canada case in 2003 and resulted in Métis people winning fishing and hunting rights formerly denied to them. But guess what happened after that? A flood of formerly white people claimed their far-flung ancestors in order to get these same hunting rights. Covering this story, the New Brunswick Media Co-op shared some census statistics comparing 1996 to 2016. In these two separate years, the population of New Brunswick was roughly the same. However, in the 1996 census, only 950 people self-identified as Métis. But in the 2016 census, the number jumped to 10,200. Figures show similar increases across Quebec, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. Yes, some of these are due to people reclaiming their identities legitimately, but the vast majority are race shifters, and they've even formed independent groups such as the Métis Nation of the Rising Sun, who have a member base of 20,000 people. To be clear, they have no backing from the Government of Canada or any Indigenous communities. In Nova Scotia, there are 9 organizations representing these so-called Acadian Métis, individuals who rely primarily on a 325 to 375-year-old ancestor to prove their identity. LaRue notes that in many cases, the same 3 women are used as the root ancestor for thousands of people. One of the most popular women is Mary Sylvestre, who was recorded as the second ever mixed marriage in Quebec in 1644. Her children were all completely assimilated into French culture, as were their children through marriages with white people. This may not seem like a big deal, but in some communities, more than 50% of the organization's members who were eligible to vote used these same ancestors as the sole proof of their Indigenous identity. This means they have an actual say in land claims. Lise Brisbois, the former chief of the so-called Mi'kmaq, said you need genealogical evidence of at least one ancestor from any time in the past, And it doesn't matter how far back as long as you feel it inside you. If you have no genealogy, you can just do a simple DNA test. This was confirmed by the CBC, who did an undercover sting in which their staff members pretended to be pretendians. Wow, that's getting meta. They all got DNA tests from the Toronto-based lab Viagard Accumetrics. Despite being from Russia and India, all three were confirmed to have indigenous DNA. Viagard Accumetrics declined an interview from CBC when questioned about receiving money from the so-called Confederation of Aboriginal People of Canada, a completely fabricated institution headed by their leader, drumroll please, His Excellency, Honorable Grand Chief Guillaume Carl, pictured here in a headdress alongside his sons, who both have headdresses for some reason. Yes, he insists you call him His Excellency. In 2016, Ganawage Grand Chief Joe Norton of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation wrote to the federal government to take swift action as the behaviors and claims of this assortment of groups was threatening Mohawk autonomy. In particular, they issued fake status cards that were used to gain tax breaks and everyday discounts. The good news is, on June 6th of 2021, His Excellency was arrested and charged with fraud. The Ganawage peacekeepers played a key role in the apprehension, and they are the only fully indigenous police force in Canada. There are more, so many more pretendians in politics, academia, the arts world, film, and they stand by their claims and continue to hold positions of influence. Multi-award-winning writer and filmmaker Ella Maiha Tailfeathers, who was both Blackfoot and Sami being her first language, worked with Latimer on the Vice series Rise. She stated in an article for TorontoNow.com that this story is about how Canadian institutions uphold white supremacy through who is given access to resources and who is not. She also mentioned that in her professional work with Latimer, she felt unsupported and ultimately walked away from the project because it did not align with her ethics as an Indigenous filmmaker. Issues of storytelling ethics were brought up in a Canadaland podcast with Inuk writer, producer, and director Alethea Arnacook-Baril, who referenced her time working alongside Latimer during The Inconvenient Indian. She approached Latimer after the initial news of her false claims with compassion for the situation and asked for her to do the work to make the connections to the community and verify her story. Despite this, Latimer waited until the media craze to show any effort in providing links. In the podcast, Alethea mentions Michelle's proximity to whiteness and the barriers Indigenous people embedded in their communities face as opposed to those who grew up outside of it. Why might this be the case? Well, let's look at the United Nations Human Development Index, which factors in quality of life. In 2016, Canada ranked number 12 in the world, while Indigenous people on reserves ranked 52nd. Latimer even has the audacity to say in an interview that, "Growing up, I didn't see my people represented on screen." Of course, this is so true for Indigenous folks, but for Michelle, at best, she chooses to identify as Indigenous. It's not the reality of her childhood upbringing or how she is perceived by the world. Even in a time of widespread anti-racism work and so-called reconciliation, being visibly Indigenous means everything from getting followed around a store by a security guard or having the cops called on you for entering a bank. Or it takes on fatal consequences. In May of 2021, after months of silence, Latimer decided to release a blog and do an interview with the Globe and Mail. She also sued 4 CBC journalists for libel amounting to $200,000 in damages. It is of note that she declined an interview with APTN in favor of the Globe and Mail. In her blog, which is a doozy, she concludes by saying that, "I am an artist and activist of non-status Algonquin, Métis, and French-Canadian heritage. I will not apologize for that." So basically, she's not sorry. Her entire blog justifies her claims, makes excuses for her behavior, and she sidesteps accountability. Playwright, theorist, and member of the Syilx and Tsilhqot'in nations, Kim Senclip-Harvey writes, Latimer's response is so saturated with imperial egoism and incompetency to grasp the blatant white supremacy, it is alarming. It is an indication of the danger of giving an individual like this power in Indigenous cultural conjuring. It also utterly fails to address the actual harm done. The need for authentic Indigenous storytellers has and always will be important for humanity. In the climate of today, these voices are finally being encouraged and supported, but policies and practices within Canada are still allowing imposters to thrive. This is why we must support Indigenous people in their calls to action and remain curious about their unique worldview, which reveals how they define nationhood, family, and indigeneity itself. This has been News with Rupert. I'll see you next time.